Welcome to the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Welcome to the HERHealth Podcast. We are so excited to have Kira Snodgrass and Mary Valenzuela with us from Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, or CASA. Kira and Mary are both sexual violence educators and have an incredible wealth of experience in supporting survivors, as well as providing education on the complexities of sexual violence. Kira, with her background in child and youth care and addictions counseling, has worked on the sexual assault response team in both Lethbridge and Calgary, providing frontline support and education. Her deep passion for supporting people impacted by sexual violence comes through in everything she does. Mary comes with a background in sociology and women's and gender studies, and she's dedicated much of her work to creating safe spaces for vulnerable communities. Whether it's immigrant youth or youth in the justice system, Mary has been advocating for change through education and dialogue for years. Together, they're helping us to rethink sexual violence prevention, challenge harmful societal narratives, and, most importantly, shift the focus onto system-level changes that need to happen. Today, we're diving into some crucial topics, like how societal structures shape our responses to sexual violence and the power dynamics that keep it normalized. Thank you again, Kira and Mary, for joining us this week. To begin, to dive us into the conversation, I'm wondering, your webinar focuses on rethinking prevention. Why is it so important to move beyond placing the responsibility for prevention on victims?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the current view of sexual violence prevention in our society is that the responsibility is on someone to not experience sexual violence, as opposed to putting the responsibility on someone to not use sexual violence to cause harm. It's a very detrimental view, and I think that narrative leads to questioning what someone did to prevent the sexual violence that they experienced, instead of recognizing that they shouldn't have had to do anything to prevent it because it shouldn't have happened in the first place. You know, someone's car window gets smashed and items are stolen from their vehicle while they're parked outside their house, and no one asked them why they were parked there and didn't park in the garage, right? Right away, the full responsibility of the situation is assigned to the person who chose to break into the car. And that same logic needs to be applied to sexual violence. I think the reason that that logic isn't applied stems from a view around sexual violence that has just developed over a history of victim blaming narratives. We had mentioned in the session that we know that in 87% of sexual assault cases specifically, the harm is caused by someone who's known to the individual that's caused harm, and classic prevention tips really are geared towards sexual assaults that are committed by a stranger. And of course, that still does happen, but it's obviously significantly less common. But with that being said, and we always reiterate this quite a bit, is that if anyone embraces the traditional prevention methods in order to make themselves feel safe, we do support them in that. We never want anyone to feel shame for things that they do in an effort to keep themselves safe. But our main point is that true prevention would mean that no one feels the need to protect themselves in the first place, because no one should be using sexual violence to cause harm. So really looking at actually addressing it at the root instead of people just scrambling to try and make themselves feel safe.
Absolutely. And I think as you talk about kind of shifting the perspective of where the responsibility comes from, being system-based responsibility as opposed to victim-based responsibility, it makes me think about kind of how you explore the root causes of sexual violence. Can you explain how societal narratives about power, gender roles, and violence contribute to the normalization of sexual violence?
So, as we've learned from the pyramid of sexual violence in the presentation, harmful behaviors like sexual harassment or sexual assault are rooted in those attitudes and beliefs, right? So, those attitudes and beliefs are learned by individuals through what we call the socialization process. So, we get exposed to many different ideologies and experiences from a very young age and throughout our lifetime, which would then influence how we form those own attitudes and beliefs that we have. And everyone will be socialized differently because we all grow up in different communities. We all grow up in different belief systems, in cultures, and also in social narratives. So those in turn would shape us and our thoughts, and it will also influence whether we think we have power or not in society and whether we think sexual violence is wrong or normal. Because we live in a patriarchal society, a lot of the ways that we have been socialized are tied to the idea that men hold a lot of power in society. And historically, men had a lot of opportunities to really shape those social narratives and influence how we think and how we teach the next generation how to think. When we've been socialized to believe that there are certain roles that people need to fulfill based on gender, or that people hold more power because their gender is superior, violence in general and sexual violence more specifically becomes heavily normalized. So behaviors like sexualizing someone or making comments about somebody's body or appearance becomes acceptable. So quote unquote acceptable when it is experienced by someone who might be seen as lacking that power and control in society. And with modern day technology, media and social media now plays a huge part in that socialization process as well. Because when the media that we consume and the online spaces where we take part in perpetuate those harmful attitudes and beliefs, it becomes even more normalized because we know that media and social media have an even wider reach in terms of audience. So now it becomes something that is global. We've also learned from the pyramid that those attitudes and beliefs are systemic. So they heavily influence how our society functions. So they can be seen in how our laws have been written, how workplace structures and policies are put in place, how some faith and religious spaces are designed for its members, even in how we view sports or different professions. So stuff that are as simple as that. So when we normalize sexism, classism, racism, etc., and we argue that things just happen, quote unquote, just happen, and we can't change them, we also normalize the harmful sexual behaviors that stem from them instead of challenging them. So once all of these things have been normalized to the point that they have now influenced our society's design, it makes it even harder for us to challenge them, and that greatly contributes to the normalization of sexual violence.
Absolutely. And it's interesting having been of a generation, at least my own, that didn't have social media, that shifted to having social media sometime
Mhm.
in my 20s. It was interesting to watch how that started to create like a confirmation bias where the algorithm puts you like on a side of TikTok is one of the sayings I know, where it just confirms and confirms and confirms what you believe. And
Mhm.
sometimes you accidentally end up over there and you're like, I see how these things get normalized and how you're not just screaming into an echo chamber, but you're talking to a lot of like-minded people and it becomes so normal and so common. And
Mhm.
it's it's wild.
Yeah, and it's getting really scary
Yeah.
because social media is just an essential part of our lives, right? A lot of times we think as social media as are like, oh, it's a space where we can take a break. But then the things that we see on there are heavy a lot of times, and they can greatly influence how we think. And something that I mentioned, I had a presentation yesterday on sexual violence in technology. And I think something that I mentioned was how it gets really scary, especially for parents. I am not a parent, I don't have children, but I can imagine how scary it can be because you don't know what your children are seeing online and how it rewires their brain because they're at that stage of their life where something can be easily digested for a child and like just be rewired into their brain. And it's really scary.
Yeah,
I
and
couldn't even imagine as a fellow childless person. I couldn't imagine. Kira, you were going to say
yeah.
something?
Yeah, I think it's just very interesting because I think the way that social media and like algorithms work now doesn't really allow us space to like challenge
Hmm.
our attitudes or beliefs about something because instead our algorithm begins to be full of stuff that reinforces it. And that can be, I think, a very detrimental and potentially dangerous thing too, right? It's quite challenging, especially with like you said, like you watch one video on something and that is what your algorithm is made up of at that point.
Absolutely. And I want to go back a little bit into it, but I love how it was integrated into the pyramid of sexual violence. And I know that you reintroduced me to it and you probably did for our viewers as well. But thinking about the pyramid of violence, it's a crucial concept for understanding sexual violence. And I personally found it very impactful when you were doing the training. Can you explain what the pyramid of violence is in a little bit more detail, Mary? I know you spoke to it a bit already, and how it shifts our thinking away from the idea that sexual violence is about things like desire and really puts an emphasis on power and control in those dynamics.
Sure. So the pyramid of sexual violence shows us the foundation of sexual violence happening, and it really helps us understand why sexual violence continues to happen and why it persists in society. And like I said during the presentation, although it's shaped as a pyramid, it doesn't really show a hierarchy of impacts, with the ones on top of the pyramid being more harmful or impactful than the ones below. That is not the case for the sexual violence pyramid. They're all, like I said, everything on the pyramid are all impactful and harmful in their own ways. And people can define and will define each experience differently. So, what the pyramid really shows us is that progression of someone being at the bottom of that pyramid and really eventually reaching the top or somewhere at the top. It shows us that sexual violence is not something that happens overnight, where one person just wakes up and decides to engage in harmful behavior. It is something that takes time. And people get exposed to many different ideologies and experiences, which ultimately influences them to make that choice to harm someone. The pyramid helps us understand that sexual violence does not happen because of sexual desire, but it happens because someone chooses to take power and control over another human being. The pyramid of sexual violence is something that we use a lot in our presentations and programming to really make sense of why sexual violence happens, whether that's our presentations for children and youth or for adults and professionals. So it's really a bit universal and with how we talk about violence and how that escalates. And that can be seen in different demographics that we talk to as well. So when we talk about the pyramid, we start by looking at the roots of sexual violence, which are those, again, attitudes and beliefs that influence how we view and treat ourselves as well as others. And this can come in the form of discrimination sometimes, and they are systemic, which means that they are stuff that influence how our society functions and gives one group of people in society more power and control compared to others. So when people internalize these harmful attitudes and beliefs, they might think that they have more power and control over another person. They might disrespect that person's consent or boundaries and engage in sexually harassing behaviors towards that individual, and they would think it's okay. Right? When those behaviors are not being challenged and these people think that it's okay to continue engaging in them, they might now engage in more physical manifestations of sexual violence because they still don't see any issue with that, right? Something to recognize though is that we as humans are quite sensitive to verbal and nonverbal cues that tell us whether someone is consenting to an activity or not. And so, if someone continues to disregard someone's boundaries and consent, they are actually actively choosing to do that. They are making an active choice to exercise that power and control that they have because they see the other person as less than them or beneath them, and they just continue to engaging in that harm. We have to remember that people are able to express their desire for someone or their attraction towards someone without resorting to violence. And these interactions should and would be consensual and not one-sided. Sexual violence is not a crime based on sexual gratification. It is based on power and control. So when we come to understand this through the pyramid, it really shifts our perspective, not only when it comes to reasons why sexual violence happens, but also with perspectives on who is responsible for sexual violence happening.
Definitely. For me, it brings to mind a lot of things. When you talk about like the pyramid of sexual violence and you talk about emphasis on power and control, it brings to light a lot of different variables and dynamics we need to think about. Another thing you shared with us in your presentation was the concept of intersectionality and how it really plays a key role in shaping how people experience and access support after sexual violence. How can organizations with intersectionality in mind address the diverse barriers faced by different communities and different survivors?
I think that it's really important to first recognize that people make sense of experiences differently, because this would allow us to open safe spaces for folks to talk about their experience and how they are personally making sense of those impacts. And this is when we talk about, or when we include intersectionality in that conversation. And it goes back to that conversation where we recognize that two people might interpret the same experience differently because they had different upbringing, cultures, belief systems, etc. And that really allows us as supporters to check in with our own biases and remind us to not bring those into that conversation in order for us to fully understand where the person is coming from and support them how they see fit. When we put that person at the center of that support, we help remove the barriers to support that they might be facing and really focus on them as individuals. When we're thinking of it as an organization, when we lead with a community-centered approach, we try to support those communities and folks from those communities with the values and norms that are important to them. So we try to adapt prevention principles, sexual violence education and conversation, as well as support to however that community operates. So we're recognizing that different communities have their own history, they have their own culture, and they have their own values that influence how they have conversations about sexual violence and how they make sense of their own experiences. When we use community-centered approach, we do not try to impose the knowledge that we have on them. Rather, we look for ways to incorporate that knowledge through conversation in ways that makes the most sense for individuals from that community. When we approach these conversations and opportunities for education from a place of respect, a place of understanding and curiosity, we are able to share that knowledge with them without overstepping. And we also learn about their experiences, which, like I mentioned a while ago, helps us educators and as an organization to gain a wider and more inclusive perspective on experiences around sexual violence.
Absolutely. It links, I think, Mary and Kira both to the piece we were talking about toward the end of the webinar around that lack of a one-size-fits-all model, because you need so much individual and community consideration in order to meet someone's needs.
Yeah, for sure. I think the person-centered approach of being able to see the person first before their experiences really allows us to not approach it with the one-size-fits-all. Because I think when we try and think about how maybe frustrating that would be if someone tried to seek support from various places and all of them just assume that they knew what this person needed because, well, they've experienced sexual violence. So this is the A, B, and C's of how to help, but instead seeing the person first and therefore seeing their experiences and even just understanding the fact that we don't know all their experiences. We probably just see the tip of the icebergs.
Absolutely. It's such an important conversation starting to emerge in a lot of spheres, like person-centered approaches and person-centered justice and what that really looks like. So we've talked about so many important things in terms of the pyramid and intersectionality and think considerations around communities and individuals and all their needs. So shifting a bit in focus to primary prevention strategies and the focus not on just individuals, but also changing systems. What are some effective community level or society-based strategies you recommend for truly preventing sexual violence?
I think, of course, a large part of inciting that change is to rally for change in policy on both political and organizational levels. But I think part of the way that we can make that shift on like the community or societal level is to embrace these conversations, have these conversations, make it something that is commonly talked about, and address our own harmful attitudes and beliefs while also challenging the harmful attitudes and beliefs of others. I think part of challenging our own harmful attitudes and beliefs is also just being aware of the privilege that we hold. And because sometimes when we talk about privilege, it's just completely viewed as negative, but that's when we use our privilege to harm. But privilege equals power, and we can use that power, that privilege, to open up these conversations, to challenge attitudes and beliefs that are harmful, and to really advocate for that change. I also think allowing these conversations or these learnings to happen at early ages for future generations is also a very key piece, which is part of what our amazing child and youth team does. All of that. But again, even just focusing on our approach of person-centered, of not one size fits all, of understanding everyone comes from different backgrounds and different impacts. I think all of that together can help us create a society where sexual violence is not tolerated, where when it happens, there's accountability, there's ownership, and hopefully one day we can have a society where it just doesn't happen at all.
That leads me so well to kind of the final question I have for both of you in terms of when you imagine a future where sexual violence is no longer normalized, what systemic changes do you believe are critical in getting us there?
I think more so based on my experience within like the frontline realm, a change in the way that sexual violence is viewed in the legal system, specifically when it's reported, having it treated like other crimes where the individual who experienced it isn't questioned as though they should have done more to prevent it. I think that'd be a great start. And then as it leads into the court system as well, not having the burden of proof on the individual to prove that they've experienced the violence. And I think with what I mentioned in terms of, I guess, social strategies, I think on a systemic level, just again, challenging those attitudes and beliefs that make up the base of that sexual violence pyramid. I gave a pretty broad answer, but I also really feel like such a focus in every facet of sexual violence is eliminating the base of that pyramid so that sexual violence just can't exist. So when we eliminate the base of that period on a systematic level, can't exist systematically. And I also think even challenging those attitudes and beliefs at that level would also help combat other forms of violence that can come from those attitudes and beliefs. So I really feel like it could filter through into other areas outside of sexual violence.
Absolutely. Mary, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think just being able to challenge those attitudes and beliefs at a very young age, because a lot of the work that I did before moving into the public side is with children and youth. And so I can see how these small conversations can create big changes for youth. A lot of times when we go to schools, when I was still a child and youth educator, we do what we call a community postcard, and you can really see how a lot of youth learn a lot and they apply that and they share that with their peers or even with their families as well. And so just starting that education and starting that challenging, because as we have talked about a while ago, young folks are hanging out in social media a lot these days. So we can try and combat that and hopefully prevent them from internalizing those things that they see on social media at a very young age, because now we're also educating them with facts and ways to support at a very young age as well. So just trying to combat it at a very early age.
Absolutely. So well said, both of you. Thank you. Before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to add? I imagine you've probably shared so much already between last week and this week, but I do just want to open up the floor for that.
Yeah, I don't think so, but yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful conversations.
Thank you, and for sharing your expertise and wealth of knowledge and experiences with us and our viewers. It's so appreciated.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on the HERHealth Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.